You're listening to the Propaganda Report with Monica Perez and Brad Binkley, and we have a jam-packed show for you today. A lot to cover. We're going to talk about how world government has become part of the progressive agenda. We're going to analyze the elite's approach to big-picture, long-range propaganda. We're going to talk about that former MI5 spy who supposedly wrote the Trump dossier, who may not even exist. We're going to show an example of how the Wall Street Journal has lost its integrity, and we're going to consider the possibility that we're being manipulated into World War III by the same people who bamboozled us into World War I and II. So get some coffee, some whiskey, an e-cigarette, whatever you need to do, and strap in because we have a lot to talk about today. Here's Monica.
This is episode 22 of the Propaganda Report with Monica Perez and Brad Binkley. How you doing, Brad?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm good. This is, what week is this? The third week of January, second week of January?
It's already, 2017 is just, it needs to be over.
It's over already. I got to do What Do I Expect from 2018?
Yeah.
So, now we've got a few, there's so many topics. I honestly think we need to do this more often because I'm overwhelmed. I could talk for an hour. Well, I could talk about anything for any amount of time. It's like it was a negative in my normal life. That's why it's so great to be able to channel, like it's like Rain Man when he was like autistic and that was a problem in many ways, but take him to a casino and he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So,
well, it's about matching people where, where the circumstances where their skill set are most useful.
Yes. And this wasn't even my idea. I was sitting next to Krista DiBiase at a wedding. And she's Clark Howard's producer. And she was like, wow, man, you just never stop talking. I was like, yep. She said, could you do that if there was nobody in the room with you? And I was like, sure, ask my husband. And he was just like, yeah, whatever. I don't listen to her.
She does work with Clark Howard, though, and he's probably about efficiency when it comes to words and just like he is in everything else.
Could be, yes, but she loved it. She was into it. She was like, that's hard. People really can't. You think you could talk and talk, but not too many people can talk as much as you can talk. So I was going to say I could talk about every single, if I read the newspaper for an hour, I could talk about it probably for 10 hours. So I've got, just from what I read in one section,
maybe we'll do a marathon.
Section. We could do
24-hour marathon.
I always wonder how my husband has the patience for it, but I really think he's just not listening to me. He's just not listening. We used to go for a walk around my neighborhood, and one of the neighbors said, it's funny to see us walk because it looks like there's a little bird flying around my husband's head. Like we're walking, and I'm like, la, 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 just like circling his head with all these, and he was into it. He'd be like, read this book. And then I'd read the book and I would tell him about it. But
that's great.
Yeah, it was then he started working too much. And, that's the story of modern life, the most productive society. And
then you had to start getting Uber rides just so you can talk to them about where they're from.
Dude, I love Uber for that reason. I mean, it's just such a cross-section of society, and they have to be nice to you.
You're going to be driving around the block over and over again in an Uber cab, and she's going to be like, looks like a little bird flying around that Uber car.
The Uber guy is thinking, I can't get this bird out of my car. So there is so much to talk about. Today I was reading an article, a special section in the Wall Street Journal about the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. I think maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Davos, Switzerland. Omar Mateen, the Orlando shooter's wife, was arrested, which was something I completely predicted as soon as it happened, that was going to be a way they were going to start roping in, see something, say something. If you don't report people, you are guilty of the crime. Because she was just present and aware. Chelsea Manning's sentence was commuted by Obama, which for me indicates the possibility that, just like I believe Julian Assange is a CIA operative, I thought Chelsea Manning was a patsy, but maybe he was in on it. And then there was this golden shower gate. I don't even know what to call that absolutely ridiculous leak of fake news. We'll have to get into it. That's a complicated story, and I think you might have to take the lead on that, Binkley. And then I got an email from a listener who thinks that Trump might be assassinated. I would love to address that. And then I did a bunch of posts this week on propagandareportdaily.com on everything from how the federal government is backdooring, taking over the police state, to the real, the multifaceted purpose of the Russian, it's beyond Russian hacking, but the whole Russian thing. So that's probably more than we can chew, and that's just the stuff I want to talk about.
Yeah, we have some overlapping themes, I think. I have two major themes, basically, and that's one of them, which won't take too long. It's just the degrading journalistic integrity, and the other is the spy stuff, and urine gate or whatever we're going to call it. There's so much to that story. There's a lot of choices and horrible puns that could leak out while talking about this, and I think we should dive into it.
Okay, where do you want? Let's talk about that one. Yeah, for me, this was a story where a British spy whose name you pointed out, like you kept pointing it out to me, and I wasn't.
Remington Steele.
It was Christopher Steele, and I used to love Remington Steele, but then you said that they were referring to the guy as like a real life James Bond and all this kind of stuff. And
let me be clear about that.
Yes.
They literally refer to him as James. One of the articles has somebody saying he is the real life James Bond. I introduced my wife to him as James Bond.
See, this is like the dumbing down of America. I see it in literature too. I've talked about it before when I on one of our shows when I talked about the Quiet American. Decades ago, when people were a little better educated, just even at the grammar school level, where actual literature is what they read, they could understand like subtlety and metaphor. It was necessary. People wouldn't believe it. Now people are so dumbed down or soundbite, reduced to sound bites that they can't. Maybe they're just too lazy and realize it's not necessary. They can't actually do any character development. They're just like, take this ready-made prototype person and James Bond and plug him into the story. But what I found insane was that his so-called report, I started laughing like in the first paragraph when or the first page when he says, Trump, because he hates Obama so much. And I'm just start laughing. I mean, are we really to believe that the highest, utmost holes of power are being won and manipulated by such ridiculous pettiness that there's no shadow government behind the scenes, that this is all about Trump just really wanting to take back this country and all that kind of stuff? It was ridiculous to think that is the motivating factor. And then it got into the hiring prostitutes to pee on the bed because Obama slept in it. That was just... It's
just so absurd. I mean, Trump owns hotels. I mean, he's aware of, where, how things can be recorded and what could go... It's just... The whole thing is just a major psyop.
But what was fantastic was his defense, which is, I'm a germaphobe. That can't be my thing. Although urine is sterile.
That's that's the response. Maybe that's why. Maybe he was... He wanted to rid the bed of all of the Obama's, germs.
Yeah, cooties.
Right. He got rid of cooties by having hookers piss on the bed.
But there was something very interesting to me about that article, and about the so-called James Bond intelligence report that Trump hates Obama. Let's see if I've got it handy. It says this is it. This is a quote from the supposed leaked intelligence report. A senior Russian official said the Trump operation should be seen in terms of Putin's desire to return to 19th century great power politics anchored upon countries' interests, rather than the ideals-based international order established after World War II. I'm going to have to read that again, but it puts the backstory, the story that's going to be in the books, in the history books 100 years from now about what happened at the turn of the 21st century between the U.S. and Russia. It's that globalism is good. The post-World War II New World Order is good. and nationalism is a Russian plot.
Yeah.
So I have to read this again. He said that the operation should be seen in terms of Putin's desire to return to 19th century great power politics anchored upon country's interests, rather than the ideals-based international order established after World War II. So this is about Russia before the Soviet Union, where it's not the good Soviet Union Russia that the liberals like, but the thing that prompted the Russian Revolution, that this nationalism. Think of all the terrible tragedy that happened, World War I, World War II, because of nationalism. Now Russia is plotting to return to its own glory days before its revolution, but you better watch out.
It was Christian Orthodox back then,
it's
too.
It's going to give you revolution. Yes, Russian Orthodox.
The Russian Orthodox, yeah. And that has been... that was set in motion. Long before this, but for me, that kind of whole idea of putting globalism, one world order as the trendy, progressive thing to do into the public consciousness, into the public conversation, to me, that all started with Brexit. That's actually wrote something about that being one of the major purposes of Brexit, where they're putting this into the world conversation so prominently. Like, why was that such a big story over in America? It ended up putting is one world government or globalism, or is nationalism better? And the demonization of nationalism was put into the public mind. And the conversation has been growing ever since then. And when Hillary did her alt-right speech a while back, where she labeled the racists as xenophobes, and she kind of associated that with nationalism and with Russia. That's what I was referring to whenever I would talk about the deplorable basket. And it's a bit of an extreme comparison, but when I talked about the deplorable basket being comparable to concentration camp, where it's like people are getting put into this evil demon basket of nationalism, which the rest of the public is being propagandized into wanting to seek help from the United Nations to come in and stop this Russian operative who's taken over America.
But here's what the irony is that made it kind of hard for me to get my mind around what you're saying, is that the deplorables are the Nazis. The scapegoat are the Nazis.
Right. Yeah. And that's
there are
why
other scapegoats too, but just in what you're saying.
Yes, but here's
scapegoats are the Nazis.
And they're using, like you just said, they're using historical reference to say we can't let this happen again, so let's use extreme measures to make sure we prevent it. I think that's where it could lead.
The historical references are all over the place, and there is such a setup. It was all over this Davos stuff I was reading, but I just want to support what you're saying. One of these posts I wrote on the propagandareportdaily.com on January 16th was Trump. The title of it was "Trump Double Dog Dares the EU to Double Down," and my point was that he came out and he made these bombastic comments about how the EU is just a front for German power, and he has no respect for it, something like that. But the title of the article, the journal article that reported this, was "Trump's Dismissal of EU Brings Call for Unity." And then the French foreign minister happens to be the mouthpiece here, but here's the quote that encapsulates the meme. This puts the thought in your mind you're supposed to take away. He says, "As is the case with Brexit, the best way of defending Europe, which is rather what Mr. Trump has invited us to do, is to remain united, to remain as a bloc, not to forget that the strength of the Europeans lies in their unity."
Yeah.
So it's complete just reaction to Trump. And so I tweeted that. And there are people Twitter followers of mine, a lot of people really still have hope that Trump is Batman, is your guy, he's going to come out and defeat the New World Order. And the more he plays into, we have to see the proof in the pudding, but the more he plays into being the scary guy, like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, who were both also referred to in that Wall Street Journal article, are the English guys who play the same kind of scary role. That the pictures, just Google their names under Google Images, and you'll just see like scary, crazy looking pictures. And this is the face of nationalism. So that to the extent nationalism or populism or any of that had legitimate gripes, just like they do with the libertarians and make them all seem like a bunch of irresponsible potheads, they make everybody who has these ideas of borders, trade barriers, immigration control, which is a valid political viewpoint, as nut jobs and Nazis. And that will make Europe has such a big, deep history of being afraid of that stuff because having fallen for it before, I think the reaction would be much stronger than any kind of nationalist success.
Yeah, and I think, and I've said similar stuff to this before, that they set up conditions where I don't know that it matters who got elected, where they could have caused the same things to happen because of the forces that they set in motion a long time ago. So the more someone fights against it, the more they could be demonized, and it's just they have so many forces of manipulation going on that somebody can be put into circumstances either knowing or not knowing, and the same dominoes could be tipped. Now, like, I am starting to think, like we talked about before, that this is a reason for Hillary not to have been elected, is to set in motion this idea that globalism needs to win out by putting the person in charge as just this demon who was put in by another country.
Yeah, we needed a reminder, a convincer that globalism is important. So you can either have World War III or you can just get people scared of World War III. You don't actually need it. And this is a reset. There was another in this Davos pullout from the Wall Street Journal today. It said, one of the quotes of one of these globalists was, I understand there are problems, but this approach, this nationalist populist approach, will prove to people that that solution is worse than the problem they were trying to solve.
Just like we planned all along.
Right. I mean, it's every time that's what I'm saying. We need to do this more often, because I could read you these little one-liners that set up the narrative, and especially in this one, because nobody is reading the Davos World Economic Forum pullout who isn't kind of high level, the target of the intellectualist propaganda. Yeah. So it's like it puts all those historical narratives in there because the people who think that they really get it need the details and the big words. I had to look up some words, and you know I think about words.
Wow.
The Wall Street Journal, words that I do. Sybaritic. I have no idea what that. I mean, I've seen the word Sybarite or something, but
it sounds like something like a drink, like a type of drink that's kind of
or a disease. They have to take something. But I'm thinking they throw those words in there, knowing darn well that less than 10% of even their intellectual readers will understand every single word in this article. I think so. It looks like this guy's giving you a super high level analysis, and it happens to be the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. Second time I've seen him put an article out in the past month, and in 5 years I haven't noticed him writing before. So I feel like they're really trying to implant in the high level academic political media circles their talking points when they stand around at these parties or events and tell each other what's really going on in the world. And then I've been to these things. I used to have kind of float around in certainly more glamorous styles than circles that I do now, where I just mostly clean up after the dogs. But in the day, I used to be around those, I was an investment banker, and you just rub elbows with those people. They'll have fundraisers, and people are working so much that nobody can go. We were right near the Waldorf, so they'd say, hey, anybody who can go to this party, if you can run home and get dressed, you can have this $10,000 seat. And I would go just to eat dinner. And so you would just see.
That's why I go to coffee shops, is to eat little bread samples.
Yeah, it's
not quite as high end.
But it was definitely worth it. But I would hear them, and even now, to the extent I have any contact with people who think of themselves as super, on the cutting edge of enlightenment, they regurgitate this stuff, and it's so clear that that's what this stuff is for. I mean, the person I went out with, that banker guy, he would tell me to read the Foreign Affairs, like the Council of Foreign Relations magazine, because that's, they really know the story. And I'm thinking, they're writing the story.
Right.
Like, they're not interpreting it. They're telling you. But either way, it's good. It's good stuff to know. But falling for it is different from recognizing it, I think.
Oh, yeah. Laswell says in Propaganda Techniques in World War, he says propaganda is targeted towards the leanest and the keenest. Like, the most simplistic for people who don't, non-intellectual type crowd, and then for the intellectual type crowd, which he says are oftentimes the easiest group to propagandize. They give them stuff like you're saying, types of language, and they give them a little bit of bait so they can reason their way to the conclusion that the propagandist had already predetermined.
Yeah, for sure. And the funny thing is when these people absolutely do not recognize it for all their intellectualism. And I did go to Harvard and Stanford. If they wanted to tell us, I went to business school, law school, and I was an economics undergrad. So there were lots of opportunities for them to scratch the surface and say, hey, man, I'm one of the people who writes these things. Like, I know darn well to leave out some of the inconvenient history. They don't tell you that. They're there to indoctrinate you at the highest level so that people at the highest levels in media and academia really believe it. That is so important to being a good face job, is really believing. And that's why they say the egomaniacs are the best, like Obama and Carter and maybe even Trump, where they don't believe they can be fooled. So if they've cracked the code and they read the Wall Street Journal and they're like, that's just what I was thinking, I'm so smart. It's like, yeah, right. You're thinking that because they told you to think that.
And propaganda, and we do it this way too, but it started with the British a long time ago, doing it to us. The approach is top down. It's go to the highest levels possible. And in a little while, I'll give you an example of how I think that's going on now. But go to the highest levels possible, because if you can influence the most powerful person who has the most influence over everybody else, then your work is done. So, I mean, literally, you start with the president. That's part of your approach and your propaganda agency. Anybody who has large groups of people who they can reach easily and who will take their word without doing any, true investigative, thinking, then they target those people and they go down level after level after that. So it's like the president, his cabinet members, his Congress, it's people who are intellectuals at universities, and people take the word of these authorities without question, and so that's why they target it that way.
Well, here's an interesting wrinkle to that, or insight into that. Zbigniew Brzezinski organized a collection of essays for the Trilateral Commission called The Crisis of Democracy. And it was from like the early 70s. And when I first started talking about it, I got it for like $15 on Abe Books. And as I started talking about it now, I bet it's $300. People can't find it. They're just disappearing. I feel like they're getting buried. But one of the things it said was democracy is a problem. You really can't herd sheep like that, herd cats like that. A great way to contain it would be to make sure everybody is in an institution. They called it non-governmental institution, but that has kind of changed its meaning a little bit over time, or whatever, has different meanings. But corporations, unions, places of higher learning, all that stuff is getting more and more consolidated at the top. And if you think of each and every one of those institutions that anybody with any kind of money or job or any kind of who's the head of the household is going to be involved in one of those institutions, it doesn't even have to be faith. What it is, and just think about your own experience. If you are writing a paper for a professor, or if you want to get a promotion, you simply do what you know that person wants you to do. I mean, the job is to please that person. The job isn't to find the truth. I even remember when I was I was a banker, and I would like puzzle over the ethics of stuff. And my boss was like, no, you have a fiduciary duty to your client. It comes from our legal system too, an advocacy thing. It's not an interrogation. It's not an investigation like I think they have in China, where the judge investigates or tries to figure out the answer. We have advocacy. So you have two sides and they both try to prove. It's not your job to prove the other side. It's your job to defend your own side. You have a fiduciary duty to that. And then you have lawyers that make sure you stay within the law. But we are really culturally trained to to be on our side, and that side can be represented by the guy in charge or whatever. But it's not even a question of faith. You don't even want to get in touch with your inner truth. You want to please the guy who's going to give you a promotion.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the foundation of propaganda, is that we're social beings. Even when we're alone, we're influenced by these social groups that we're part of, and we're influenced by the authority figures represented in those social groups. And when we don't have a leader around to guide us, we are guided by symbolic language, symbols of those groups. And the propagandists just play people off of their various group influences. Bernays talks about that all the time. Like, the most important thing is to understand the group dynamics of society and how they're interrelated, and how mass psychology can be used to propagandize the individual.
Yes. Oh my gosh. First of all, I hope we can get to the word that there's like a K word that we texted about. If you can figure that out, I think it goes into this. But here's the thing about the mass psychology. When Cruz was running, one of the things I believe I said on the air on my WSB show about Ted Cruz had Cambridge Analytica working for him. And they categorized people into 6 psychological types. And he would literally text people according to their psychological type. He would target his message to those people, even to the point where I think he did some Israeli conference or IPAC or something. And his texts or tweets or whatever, his communications were limited to the 4 walls of the hotel where the conference was. And I was like, maybe he's just in this race to get the data, the value of the data of the people who have given him this insight is going to be tremendous. And then when he dropped out of the race, Trump used Cambridge Analytica. So no doubt now they have all the information you could possibly have of half of the voting country, because you had basically the Cruz camp and the Trump camp of the GOP. And then I further saw that I believe the owner of that company is this guy Mercer, who was in a spread in the Wall Street Journal as being one of Trump's secret billionaire donors or some odd thing, who's going to wield a lot of influence. His daughter is on the transition team or the pick the cabinet team or whatever. So the psychological analysis, data, all that kind of stuff, which I believe is centered in this Cambridge Analytica, happens to be this guy who was deep into the campaign of Trump, worked for Cruz. I think there's something there. I think there's something very
There's absolutely something there. They're following the engineering of consent model, with variations based on modern technology. But one of the things that
Bernays,
and
it must have consent.
Yeah, one of the things that he emphasized more than anything else was that you're not going to be able to propagandize these various groups if you do not first do like elaborate intelligence gathering on the various unconscious motivations of the differing groups, what motivates them that they're not even aware of, and how can you substitute your policies and your ideas for the things that they commonly seek to satisfy those needs, like whether it's status or whether it's to make their neighbor think that they make a lot of money at their job, whether it's to impress their wife. It's finding the various ways that these different groups satisfy all these deep desires, and then making your policy or your candidate the way that they do that.
And it is different groups. Like, that's an important element to it.
That's everything.
They really get that. And that's not stuff that they share with us a lot. You never hear them talk. You never hear Dr. Oz, talking about that level of stuff, or when they have those kind of analysis on Fox. You never hear anybody refer to that stuff because it loses its real power if you see what's behind it. But they absolutely, I think, and I don't know if I understand you correctly, but I think you introduced this concept to me, that psychology is much more of a science than we're led to believe, that they have answers.
I mean, billions. Like this book, Getting Us into War, it talks about some of the financing that goes into information offices and propaganda offices back during World War I and World War II, and it talks about how it's the best money spent, and they spend more on that than just about anything else. Probably not weapons or anything, but they've been studying how to manipulate the group mind systematically for over 100 years.
Well, and it's probably in the defense budget. I mean, the defense budget's big and sprawling, and and I've been trying to figure out this. You know, my alerts go off with the driverless car thing, and I just briefly, just cursorily wanted to see how much the government was behind that technology, because that technology, like speech to text, was always considered to be completely not worth the effort. Like, it's just so expensive that it just a supply and demand. You have enough people to drive, you would not do that. But I just stopped researching it immediately because it's like overwhelming how much of its stuff came out of the Department of Defense, MIT, government-sponsored research, just all that stuff. It's clearly that this stuff is in the defense budget, that it comes out of the Defense Department, and psychology too, like Project MK Ultra, where they was mind control. MK for like mind control with a K. I don't know. But that stuff was all considered defensive, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and they're also, I mean, they do all kind of programs for this. Like Stanford is basically, it's like 97% funded by the government, and they do all these social science experiments. They've been doing them for decades. There's a lot of other Ivy League institutions are similar. They have organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation. They fund a lot of these projects to specifically study social science things. It's social experiments. They just do social experiments on people. Like that, what was that thing where people would play the game, the Pokemon thing, where people would go do the Pokemon interactive thing. They'd be like going to people's houses and stuff, trying to get their Pokemon. So that was a big social experiment.
Oh, it really fell out of the news. It was in the news like 24/7 for a while there.
All that stuff, like the stuff they do on Facebook to trigger reactions out of people. These are social experiments. They take that information, they use it to develop techniques that they can apply to the modern communication systems as a way to influence people through those systems. And one of the things they've been doing for the past few years is the White House Brain Initiative, which is they're basically trying to map all the neurons in the brain so that you can essentially push a button and cause people to do whatever. Like they can control a rat with a remote control, like a wireless remote control, because they have a lot less neurons in their brain, so they've been able to map some of them. I mean, it's super complex, and I personally don't think they're ever going to be able to map all of the billions of neurons, but they're trying to do it, and that's the point. They're trying to essentially, if they are able to do that, then it's press of a button.
You know what makes me bummed about it all is that it won't be used for good. You know, I feel like it's a bummer because all the money and power go to the top. By force, perforce, it's in order. It's by people who are so crazed for power and control that they will deceive you, kill, steal, kidnap, enslave. I mean, that's really what the abuse of power at the government level and whoever the human beings who are behind that are doing. So when you take when they take half the money, half the production of the country through taxes for all the different governments, and a lot of that is defense and education, it's all to make those strides of human achievement in the hands of the guys who want the power the most. And it's, you know, they're not constrained by ethics or goodwill. It's just a sad state of affairs. It makes me wonder why, you know, if God made the world this way, why did he let this power, the bad, have the most power? But I feel like C.S. Lewis said that this earth is not in the good are not going to win, that the earth is not for the good to win this battle. Sorry, I hate to go down that road. I hate to talk about religion or good or evil because I really don't know. I don't think I know the answers, but just on a metaphysical level, it makes me sad to think, you start to lose hope.
Well, I mean, they do at the highest levels. They think that an intelligent few an intelligent, educated elite needs to lead the masses because the masses don't have the education or the understanding of foreign affairs to be able to even think clearly. I mean, there's quotes from Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, all these Cass Sustin, all these top propaganda, Sunstein.
Sorry.
Yeah. All these top propagandists, they believe that. They're very elitist in their mindset. But they're not immune from this thinking, though. They seem to think themselves immune from getting impassioned and being affected by their emotions and their unconscious thoughts like everybody else is. But when you read their writing, it's very clear that they are affected by the exact same things, and they're blind to it. They have these blind spots, which makes them subject to the manipulation of others. Like, for example, the British, World War I, manipulating all the elites in the United States because they didn't think they thought they were immune to it. When it comes to the idea of the good and evil, I personally always think that I think the goal is to reach a higher level of consciousness. I think that's, to me. And I don't think these elites, I don't think they're going to reach those higher levels of consciousness, because when the intent is on something bad, I think they're going to hit a roadblock. So I think people that are good have a better opportunity to do that. And I think that is where the opportunity to prevail over some of the more negative forces exists, in my opinion.
Well, there's an awful lot of stuff on the internet about occultism in the elite circles, and I really never know what to make of it, because it could be there, like the lizard people thing, where maybe it's there to just distract people, to put a rabbit hole that's really, really, really deep so that people never get out of it. Or maybe the occultism is used as a way to control people. Like, you see a lot of videos of like rap singers or whatever talking about the Illuminati, and you wonder if it's really a control mechanism. But a lot of it acts like these guys really believe it. They have satanic worship and they get real power from the dark side. Huh?
I think a lot of them do believe it. I don't think all of them believe it. I think it is used to control, but people at the highest levels, I think they do believe it.
Yeah, that may be true. I just don't know. I really don't. I can't. It's fascinating. It's my truth porn. I'd love to just like, wow. Like, I want to dig deeper. Really? That guy? Wow. Really? It's just so crazy.
Saul Alinsky, he talked about, all these guys talk about it, but he talked about, never believe the stuff you're propagandizing, essentially, because the rigid patterns of thought that people who are gripped by their ideology, if you get gripped by that same ideology, then you don't have the flexibility to reach your objective. But use that ideology, use those impassioned feelings, those rigid thought patterns to manipulate those groups of people. And the same is true when it comes to this occult stuff. And Saul Alinsky in particular, he would always say that he would make those comments about how Satan was the first radical or stuff like that. He said those things to play into that myth of him. And he did that on purpose. It's very clear when you read his book. And I think some of these people at the highest level, they understand that they can use these existing prejudices. I sound like I sound like George Bush or something trying to say that word.
Strategery.
They can use those existing feelings that have so much power over people to get them to react in specific ways. Okay.
I am leaning in the direction of thinking that, for the most part, they do not actually believe it. But I will say that with this, I've been watching, somebody turned me on to it recently, and I binge watched it. I was talking about it on Twitter, and I think maybe I included you in some of those tweets. This Scientology expose by Leah Remini, who left Scientology, and it's really fascinating. It's obviously some serious hit stuff on Scientology, and I try not to take stuff like that with a grain of salt, but what these people are saying is pretty damning. But if you look back, I read a book called Strange Angel about Jack Parsons, who was a Satanist in Pasadena, California, and helped found the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, kind of started working in some back rooms at Caltech, although he wasn't affiliated with Caltech. But he was an Aleister Crowley acolyte. He was a Satanist, and L. Ron Hubbard apparently was in that crowd in Pasadena. He was an Aleister Crowley guy. L. Ron Hubbard had been, I think, a sci-fi writer. This book, I believe it was in this book or maybe another book, I read about it, that science fiction was basically rolled out by the intelligence agencies. And these guys also tie in with Satanism and other, occult, and cults are really the same word, and culture. So L. Ron Hubbard, what he created in Scientology is for sure a cult. I don't think anybody would deny that. It goes deep, and I think it looks to me like control mechanisms, like they target different kinds of people who are gravitate towards kind of deeper truths, and if they can put false truths out there, that keeps a lot of people distracted for a long time.
Oh yeah, and the more deeply people buy into certain belief systems, the more predictable their behavior is when triggered by certain stimuli, like
that's very
symbols, flags,
symbols.
words. That's why every movement has a specific symbol, because when people see it, who want to be part of that movement, who are deeply moved by what that movement means, they know what to do. It's the Colin Kaepernick thing, the take a knee, the hold a fist up, triggers. Whatever it is. Yeah, it triggers.
Triggers are predictable. Triggers are not by accident.
No, exactly. So when you understand, and this is what Bernays talked about, is when you understand these things that certain groups are that make them tick, that they're deeply motivated by, and you can crystallize those. Basically, he played off of felt oppression. He pulled up pain people felt, and he directed it at somebody who he labeled their oppressor. And he would symbolize whatever the movement is that he was doing with some sort of slogan or some sort of physical act that was clear, distinct, and easily recognizable. And then he would communicate it through all the systems of mass communication that is available, so that it would reach people on a national or a global scale through all those systems of mass communication. They would see those symbols, hear those words, identify themselves with those groups, and then they would be compelled to action. That's how he would create mass social movements.
Well, that, as one of the things you were saying, I have a few things I want to catch up on of the things that you've said. But just on that one point, I've always noticed this about how sad it is to exploit racism by targeting young people who are naturally insecure. And because I've seen this, because I was a very, very insecure teen. I had terrible hair. My clothes weren't good. I didn't have much money. What
was wrong with your hair?
It was before, they really made a tremendous strides in hair products. So if you look, somebody told me to watch V, some alien sci-fi show, V.
For Vendetta?
No, it was a sci-fi movie, so a TV show. So I went and got the DVDs, which is unheard of these days. But I got the DVDs. It ends up I got the wrong one. I got one from the 80s. It was the new one's a remake, and the captain was a chick, and her hair was so frizzy, and she had a saddlebag butt and all this kind of stuff, and I was just oh my gosh, what's happened since the 80s? People do lipo, you get rid of that, you never see that stuff anymore. They have the stuff that takes the frizz out of your hair, all these things. But as a kid, I was just totally, really, really insecure, and with good reason. I was not my best. I hadn't reached my potential yet. I was a late bloomer. But when I see the kind of, there was a whole show on CNN about Malia's hair. I don't know, the Obama girl's hair. Yeah. And it was really people mocked it, because the whole thing was about the importance of black hair, I think was what it was called. And they really made a stink about how she must feel about her hair. And I get it. I get if you're in a minority and, people don't understand you or don't accept your look. I understand the problems, but a lot of the insecurity that you have as a teenager is natural to everyone, and you have to work through it. But if you tell people that the source of it is that you are the object of somebody else's oppression, you resent it, and you externalize the power. So you stop trying to work through it. I mean, I spent my whole life trying to get some confidence, and some of that means learning how to kind of soften the edges or whatever it is, or just feel good about yourself or whatever it is, feel powerful. I can overcome this. And then you have a sense of accomplishment. I mean, I have a sense of accomplishment every time I, have a good hair day, but maybe that's an exaggeration, but I'm just saying, like, I feel good. I feel happy that I've conquered, that I feel better about myself than I did then. And I always notice that a lot of the political exploitation of race is simply taking natural feelings that everybody feels or just some people feel and attributing it to, blaming somebody. I mean, maybe it's just as easy
that's exactly what they do. That's why it's important that they keep people anxious and insecure, because when people are down, it is easy. It's a lot easier to accept that someone else is to blame than to, as we talked about last week, to reflect on it and attempt to overcome. I mean, that's challenging when you're when you feel insecure. It's incredibly challenging. And when you have a bunch of media riling up that pain, making you feel that pain worse, and then saying it's not even your fault, there's nothing you can do about it, it's this person's fault.
Or you can do this. You can do something. So it gives a lot of power to the people who are doing that. Like John Lewis, I was trying to catch up on all this dispute between Trump and John Lewis. And he always says, like, if you see something wrong, you need to do something about it. Don't sit around. So even when there were riots brewing, he was saying that. And I always think it undermines a little bit, because in a representative system, we're supposed to use the power of the pen and that kind of thing. But he can harness that power. Not only, I shouldn't target him. I really don't know much about him, but yes, somebody asked me. I saw him when I was marching against Obamacare. We kept waiting and waiting for congressmen to come out, waiting for hours. I went there 3 times to DC, and you really never saw anybody except for at a certain point, Nancy Pelosi and John Lewis walked arm in arm, and she had her big mallet, like her call to order mallet, and walked right through the crowd. Yes, she was carrying it. I could. This is from memory, so maybe I have to pull up and make sure there's a picture. But apparently there's like a tunnel where the congressman can avoid protesters completely. So he went with her and walked through, because they were saying that the Obamacare protests were really because people hated Obama because he was black, that it was really a racial thing. Yes, and they were trying to provoke people. And I remember distinctly they were trying to provoke people, and then later they did make up stories that were not in evidence of spitting and racial slurs and all that kind of stuff, because they really wanted to get a lot of leeway to impose socialism.
They were hoping for somebody to say something.
Yeah, but it not only gives them power, but it disempowers these individuals. As a libertarian individualist, it disempowers them.
Yeah, it disempowers the people that they claim to be helping. And this is why, like, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, their entire career depends on people feeling oppressed and feeling like they're not capable. So they go around, they stir up a bunch of things, and they make people think that there's nothing that they can do except blame someone else. And then they, in turn, step in. They start the fire, then they show up with the water and say, let me put it out for you.
Yeah, it's this pathocracy. It's the same feeling as the pathocracy, where pathological meaning, opposite, dysfunctional, whatever, sick. The government's supposed to defend you, and because of that, it gets all its power out of defense.
Yeah.
Whether it's individual or national defense or whatever it is, it's supposed to defend you or help you or whatever. Some people have different viewpoints of it. It's either to defend you physically and protect your property, or to help you through a tough time with a safety net. But in any case, we have already reached the point, in my opinion, of pure pathocracy, where the government's number one goal at the very highest levels is to make sure that we do not have peace or prosperity, because an end of poverty and all that kind of stuff. Because if we did, they would not have any power. That's where their power comes from. And that's what they are.
Right. The status quo gives them their power. So one of the top priorities for them is to maintain the status quo under the illusion of progress.
Yes, but they have maintain it or even force it backwards. But there were a couple of other things you mentioned that I wanted to touch on. This idea that these guys have where they're the ruling elite and we're too ignorant or untrustworthy or whatever. That's Plato. That was Plato's idea, although it's, again, I think a pathological adaptation of it. I also think that, like, medieval church was a Plato idea, and it was not. Maybe it was. I really don't know enough about it. But anyway, we can see that maybe it can't work. But in any case, that's the working theory, I think, rather than the individualist Aristotle thing. But, makes me wonder if the individualist Aristotle, or like when they say that if England barely expelled, if at all, the Vikings because they had already had Christianity and they couldn't fight as barbarically as the Vikings did, that, that these enlightened things just make you more vulnerable to people who are willing to abandon ethics and band together for pure power. So that's a problem. And I also wanted one more thing.
All right.
Okay. You were saying how these guys are in it, but you can see their vulnerabilities. And I got a text email from JQ saying he thinks they might off Trump and like the CIA. And I thought, I've been noticing for years that the Secret Service is being set up for something. I thought something big, they're been presented as incompetent. There were several like full spreads in the Wall Street Journal about Secret Service failures. And that to me is like never wasted. So I was thinking about, my response to him was that they might, I think Trump's in on it, but I don't be mad at me. I'm just telling you my opinion. I could be wrong. I think he's in on it. And I think that he's in that his ego is just being exploited by them, which is basically the same thing. But Nixon was he was really deep state. Gerald Ford, extremely deep state. He came up with the magic bullet theory of JFK. Reagan, I feel like, was deep state. And in those three cases, for example, those guys were taken out or attempted to be taken out. Nixon, Watergate was supposedly, and I believe it, a coup to get him out of office. Gerald Ford, they tried to assassinate him twice. Reagan, they tried to assassinate. My point is that they're vulnerable even though they're in on it. Like, there are vulnerabilities. And Reagan was into astrology, if I recall correctly. So maybe, he had, after that,
his wife was into the paranormal.
Oh, really? Because they did control him. After the assassination, he got in line. And I wonder if that, and I think some of those belief systems and some of his advisors and stuff made him, vulnerable to a Rasputin type guy who went through the wife, went through the vulnerabilities to exercise
I think
influence.
I think there's the idea that everybody thinks that they're completely in the know at that level. Like, where it's kind of like, oh, I know what's going on. There's no people aren't running around on me. But then there's a point in time when they realize they're not completely in the know. There's another higher level of deception that they were unaware of, and that they're being used as a puppet. And perhaps that influences them to want to resist. There
is the original House of Cards series was British, not the one with Kevin Spacey here.
Yeah.
It was quite possibly the best TV I've ever seen. The first season of Deadwood was up there, but this was unreal. And there were 3, I had the VCR tapes, but there were 6 of those. I don't know what it is now. I won't spoil it because it's so great. I'm urging people to watch that whole thing, every single solitary episode from beginning to end. And then, the true nature of power is so interesting there, but it demonstrates what we're talking about now. I can't spoil, but I just have to urge people to watch it. It's just a tease. You have to figure it out yourself by watching that fantastic production.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one. I've seen the American one.
I won't watch the American one, not even a minute of it, because I just don't want to at all. I'll just be sitting there the whole time like, oh, they did it so much better. Oh, they did it so much better. Anyway.
Yeah, well, the American one to me is basically like, all right, what can we do that's the most shocking thing possible each episode? It just gets to a point where it was ridiculous.
Not like that at all. Oh, by the way, I started to watch Westworld. Which,
you
again,
sent me a text about that.
I thought it was like the movie. I loved the movie way back when with Yul Brynner in it. This is a TV show. And it reminded me of you because you seem to have a fixation. I'm not even going to get with you. You have highlighted the emerging theme of sex robots in the real world.
Yeah, I have a fixation on it because I think it's going to be used to subvert the family and just make people completely antisocial. I think it's a propaganda tool.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, it's a population control thing also.
Oh, yes, that's so true. But these robots, many of whom are sexual objects, it seems to me, I just started watching it, that the whole darn thing is about cognitive dissonance. The whole show is about the robots being like, what? What's going on here?
They don't realize that they're robots?
I don't think they do. And it's just, I had said last year what to watch out for was this increasing awareness or lip service to or of cognitive dissonance. You know how they kind of give you, they tell you, they reveal stuff, they predict stuff, they telegraph it to get you used to it. And this cognitive dissonance, it's these, I get it myself from this overwhelming amount of information coming out of the internet that what's real? How deep is the rabbit hole? I mean, when Trump won, I got an email that said, my faith in the system has been restored. And I was like, oh my gosh, was that a sign?
Right.
What the heck?
Cognitive dissonance, that's why we're so vulnerable to propaganda. It's easy to point to propaganda that's being spread by someone that you don't care about at all, that you don't like particularly, and see. It's easy to see people being influenced when you are completely removed from it, like looking back to Nazi Germany or looking at another country. But it's always like, oh, that other country's being manipulated. But of course we're not. Of course.
But there are even deeper levels than looking back at that. Anthony Sutton's Wall Street and Hitler. I mean, there's just crazy stuff that went behind the scenes there, and like with the Russian Revolution, that you know what I mean? There actually are layers to the onions, and that's just looking back with clarity. Now we're in a world where they're going out of their way to really, really confuse us. I mean, it's it is overwhelming, and the cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable.
Yeah, I wrote an article about that a few weeks ago where one of the first jobs of the propagandist is to convince people that propaganda is simple and that they understand it. That way they're completely blind to the propaganda that's working on them. That Trump thing, I knew. I was like, I'm missing something.
I've been fooled before. I was fooled with the Jeb thing. I totally thought it was going to be Jeb versus Hillary and one of those guys would win, whatever. It's so obvious. It's so clear what they're doing. And then I was like, wow.
But speaking of that, like, I want to go into back to that thing we were talking about earlier, the spy thing. I think that's there's a couple issues. Can I go into that? Or you?
Yeah.
There's a couple of issues associated with that for me that stood out. One of them was the fact that it was reported and spread based on, it was a rumor essentially that still really hasn't had anything to back it up, and it was being spread by the Wall Street Journal. And the other thing about it is that I think that it's part of this larger theme, like World War I, World War II. We were manipulated by the British into both of those wars through a large-scale, subtle, indirect propaganda plan, very, very coordinated, without us being aware of it, where they directed our attention to an enemy through subtle infiltration of the highest levels of government and of society. And then after the war, we discovered it, but then it was kind of not taught in schools, and then it fell out of the collective consciousness, and then it just happened again. And like I see the same patterns emerging again with with this British thing going on, connecting all the way back to Brexit. So which one do you want to go first? So you want to go with the World War, or you want to go with the theme of the Wall Street Journal propagating a rumor? They're both connected to the spy thing. Let's start with the Wall Street Journal, because that's a specific propaganda tactic because I've really been focusing on some of these things lately, just because they all do it.
It was super crazy that they came out and gave that all sorts of press, because I was laughing when I read it. I was laughing.
Right. So the Wall Street Journal.
I just want to say, could you imagine if you and I were sitting here talking and one of us saw some dumb thing like that and we're like, oh my gosh, look at this. Can you believe Trump did this? And it's because he hates Obama. Could you imagine? Yeah. We were just like, okay, can we check our facts here before we start spreading stuff that's so on its face ridiculous?
Right.
Even if it were true, it would be too ridiculous.
Exactly. Even if it comes out, even if it turns out that this is true, it doesn't change the fact that initially it was completely spread based on a rumor that lacked evidence, and the public has accepted some of it anyway. Like, the public has accepted that Christopher Steele wrote it, and nothing
it's written in such an unprofessional manner. It goes into all this what they call normative stuff. Like, it's judgmental. It's bizarre. It's completely unprofessional.
I just want to point out what the Wall Street Journal, which is one of the most respected
it's a conservative newspaper of record.
News organizations, what they relied on, because they are the ones who initially identified Christopher Steele, ex-British intelligence officer, said to have prepared Trump dossier. They're the ones who initially publicized this. And all these other news, I have all these clippings from these other news organizations that all cited the Wall Street Journal in their stories. See, what happened is they cited that he did it, and then they just ran with it, and they talked about how amazing of a source he is, I guess as a way to try and validate the claims, where it's like there's no actual evidence that's been confirmed to support the claims in the dossier, but hey, James Bond
the
wrote
authority
it, so.
I've been saying that it's always all you get, and they're really, even during the fake news thing, they keep emphasizing the imprimatur, the of the source, the credibility of the source, the authority of the source is what you need to look at. And they won't even stoop to supporting things with evidence, because they don't want that to be the standard. What they want is, we are acceptable news. This guy is a person who can be trusted. It's a classic fallacy, which is it's not an ad hominem attack. It's this resort to authority when authority alone is not evidence.
And, when you analyze propaganda, if you go to the authority and you ask the questions, like good journalism, investigative journalism, it's going to have that, the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, why, and H, how, and then it's going to have the so what. All that stuff is going to be, so what, why does this matter? All that stuff is going to be right in the first couple of paragraphs. And we've gotten to the point where none of it's there. We're relying on nothing. Right. Like in the Wall Street Journal, we have, this is the opening paragraph. A former British intelligence officer who is now a director of a private security and investigations firm has been identified as the author of the dossier of unverified allegations about President-elect Donald Trump's activities and connections in Russia. Then here's the source. People familiar with the matter say. That is.
Oh, that's always it. Those people say. It'll later in that paragraph. I don't even know what you're reading, but later it'll say those people say.
The people said. The next one says, Christopher Steele, a director of the London-based Orbis business, prepared the dossier. The people said. They might as well have said the universe said. Said the universe.
Mickey Mouse said. I just made up.
Exactly.
I've been highlighting that for years, and when you can, I noticed this with, who is the guy? General Alexander was testifying before Congress, and I was avidly reading every article I could from the Wall Street Journal about that. And I noticed that articles from one day to the next had contradictory backstories, just truly backstories that did not make sense, that did not go together. And it later came out very clearly this guy had been lying anyway, which they did not particularly emphasize and continue to use him as a source, like James Clapper, who's a complete liar, and he's the source. He's he perjured himself in Congress that he's the source for the Russian hacking. Trust me, intel. It's all about changing the standard.
Exactly, and the standard is completely degraded. So now that's the source, right? And I'm gonna read you what it's up against in this article. What it's up against, keeping in mind that based on this article, this was cited by like everyone. It was just accepted as truth. It was spread around by everyone. So you go down further in the article and you see Mr. Steele is one of 2 directors of the firm, along with Christopher Burrows, Orbis intelligence firm. Mr. Burrows reached at his home outside London on Wednesday, said he wouldn't confirm or deny that Orbis had produced the report. So his co-worker won't confirm or deny.
Nothing.
Right. And my opinion on that is this, and this is actually something that was in Art of the Deal, where I believe it was Princess Diana was coming. I think it might have been after her wedding, was going to be staying in New York for a night before going on their honeymoon. I believe that's who it was. And there was a lot of speculation that she was going to be staying at Trump Tower. So a bunch of reporters came to Trump and were like, is Princess Diana staying here? Is she staying here? And she wasn't staying there. Trump hadn't even heard of that. But Trump didn't say no, because it would have turned away all the publicity. So he said that he couldn't confirm or deny it. So you're not going to get this guy to say no. He might say yes, but he's going to lose free publicity if he says no.
And he doesn't want to be in trouble either. I mean, you'd start to be like, I don't know. Don't ask me. What do I know?
Then,
I never knew he was a spy.
And then we get to the point where it's a neighbor of Mr. Steele's said Mr. Steele had said he would be away for a few days, right? So he's not even around.
So, anybody who's an actual lawyer, no, that kind of thing is such nonsense. You can find a lot of these things, like with terrorists and stuff, they can't find anyone to say anything. So they're like some crazy uncle he hasn't seen in 30 years said he never liked the kid. How many people do you have to call before you can find someone who will take your money and say what you want him to say?
All right. So far, here's what we got so far. We have people familiar with the matter is what the evidence is based on. Then we have the person who is closest to him will neither confirm nor deny it. And we have a neighbor who said he'll be gone. So nobody can find this guy. And then we have, to me, what is the kicker in all this is in previous weeks, Mr. Steele had declined repeated requests for interviews through an intermediary who said the subject was too hot. So the Wall Street Journal, it appears, hasn't even talked to the guy. And who is this intermediary? Are they talking to him through email? Are they meeting with him in person? Do they have any idea who this intermediary is and why they have any credibility?
It reminds me of when I was listening to NPR a couple of weeks ago, and John McCain, who, if anyone knows everything, it's John McCain, said he personally did not have any access to the intel on Russian hacking, but that he read an article about it in the New York Times, and they must have gotten it from somewhere.
I have something about John McCain, too, in a minute. Yeah,
it's just
must have
crazy.
Gotten it from somewhere, right.
And so I just wanted to highlight that I have several times, like the Chattanooga shooter, they said, like, he was from Kuwait, which is an ally, and they were like, he self-identifies as Palestinian, and I kept clicking the links, and eventually the source of it was supposedly like some picture from on Facebook. It might have been there. It might have been there. But the source, as it kept going deeper and deeper and deeper, just one echo chamber media source to the other, was like, it said a Facebook post and it highlighted Facebook. And I clicked on it and it was like an ad for Facebook. Or like it defined the word Facebook. And I was like, okay, no one has this. There are numerous things like that. The Russian hacking is like that.
Right.
So they'll always like echo chamber that to death and act like that's the source. But I will tell you just what you're seeing, like the people said or a neighbor said or whatever.
I mean, there's more in this.
Once you're sensitive to that, and I'll let you finish because I'm interested in the content, but once you're sensitive to that, if you were to like blackline everything in the newspaper that said that, just take it out the way Thomas Jefferson blacklined everything in the Bible that Jesus did not say. And he came up with the Jefferson Bible, which is 45 pages. Yeah. And it's just what Jesus said.
That's interesting.
It's super interesting. I bought it, but I haven't read it yet. And it's only 45 pages. I should be ashamed. But if you went through your journal or whatever and you just put a black mark, what do they call that? Like when you get like an FOIA request and it's all full of those black lines that you can't see anything.
Redacted?
Redacted, yeah. If you redact everything in there that's by an anonymous source, and when an anonymous source is a government source, not authorized to comment, that person is committing a crime and should be penalized for that, or he's planting a story so that he has no accountability. No one has any accountability. You know what I mean? Either way, it should not be 100% of the time sources that aren't authorized to comment. And once you're sensitive to that and you see that the mainstream media has absolutely rarely, I would say 75% of the time, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever.
And what is familiar with, I mean, at this point, most of America is familiar with the situation. Maybe I'm the source. Maybe you're the source. Like, it's just, what does that even mean?
And it's all about the source. See, that's the thing. There is no evidence at all in this case. And that's
the guy hasn't come forward, you know. Another thing, like, because here's what people might cite in defense to this, because later, first of all, it doesn't matter if there are claims of this that come out to prove some of this later. It's the standard of being willing to spread something in hopes that it eventually comes true that we've accepted, because this means they're spreading the best, top, most respected people we have are spreading rumors that maybe sometimes end up being true, but don't. This is no different than sitting around in your basement with a bunch of your buddies, just spreading rumors that you read or heard from your friends.
This fake news thing, I've noticed it from the beginning. When the Washington Post, I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was the Russia hacked a Vermont power grid or some odd thing. Whatever. It was from the very beginning, the mainstream media, during this whole fake news psyop that's going on, has played into it by themselves, adding clearly fake news stories, which, as opposed to their normal news, which is fake news but not so obvious. And I think I have a theory of why that is, but you can say what you want to say. But I'll tell you what my theory is, and then you can tell me what you want to say. The theory that I have is they're going to set up a compromise position where, yes, we're going to eradicate fake news from Russian propaganda and also from those pesky internet truthers or media types. You know, we're gonna consolidate mainstream media, and then mainstream media itself, as we can see, because they get things wrong sometimes, they themselves have to be held to a higher standard. They will have to get their stories approved by the central scrutinizer or whatever. Yeah. And what you'll end up having is you have to see that regulations benefit the big guys who can deal with it.
Exactly.
So, like Marlboro supposedly got past the law banning tobacco advertising because they had the market share. They could sell their cigarettes, but nobody else could sell their cigarettes if they didn't have access to advertising. So they locked in market share for decades. And same thing with like the progressive era, where they had all these big business regulations put in place. Well, once you do that, once you have tremendous tax laws and health and safety requirements and minimum capitalization, all that kind of stuff, very few people can compete with you. Or like if you have to collect all the metadata of all the calls in the whole world, then only the super big telecom companies are going to be able to actually have telecom services. And they, of course, behind the scenes are working with the government to ensure that these barriers to entry stay up. So the whole media cyber bill that's, I'm sure, the cyber or information bill, or it'll be different, media omnibus bill, will not only put up barriers to entry, it will like regulate the news itself from the inside, and it'll look like a give, but really it'll just put the last nail in the coffin of any kind of journalism. And then you'll have this resort to authority. Well, the central scrutinizer gave this a check mark, so you're good.
Yeah, it gives all the power to those at the top. And that's what my theory is right along with that, and which I'll go into in a minute, but it's also associated with the idea of the British influence over this. Prior to World War I.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you said that, because I was just about to say something like that. Go, and I'll tell you.
The British, without the population realizing it, took control over the channels of communication. That only British messages were getting through to the American public because they were filtering them from the top down and through various. They essentially bought off some of the top media organizations, and the German message was not getting through because they controlled all the media. So we were getting British messages, British propaganda through American trusted sources without hearing any of the opposing arguments because they were blocking it all out. And that is, in fact, when the term propaganda took on a negative tone. Prior to then, it wasn't even
just
used.
Just propagate, yeah.
Yeah, but that's when it became negative because the propagandists that were manipulating us started pointing to everything that the people they were demonizing was doing, and they labeled it evil propaganda, evil German propaganda, which was in and of itself propaganda.
Yes.
And that's why the term ultimately, that's one of the reasons that's why it eventually morphed into public relations, is they had to create a new way to speak about it because people didn't like the term propaganda. And again, that's not to say that the Germans were good or weren't doing bad stuff. They were trying to propagandize us too. They just sucked at it. Like, it's historically written about how bad during World War I they were so terrible at propaganda. Hitler writes about how bad the Germans were at propaganda in World War I, how good the British were, how good the Americans were at propagandizing their own people, and that was his inspiration to get better at propaganda. So, like, the subtle forces that influenced us were unrecognizable to the public. The messages were filtered to the public by people who didn't realize they were spreading propaganda. And meanwhile, propaganda is getting a bad name because the people who are manipulating us are saying, hey, look at that evil propaganda from that monster over there.
Well, it's interesting that you're pointing out what a big role the British had, because I know everybody knows this, but it just kind of hit me today, maybe, that Rupert Murdoch is, for all intents and purposes, British. He was born in Australia. He went to Oxford. He's definitely Australian, but he's very active in politics in the UK.
Yeah.
He's British, you know. Our Wall Street Journal and Fox is a British operation.
Right,
yes,
and that's exactly what it was during World War I. And after I finished going through this article, I have some specific quotes and some information I found a little bit ago that supports the same pattern that led up to World War I and II of the subtle British influence. And I'll point those out in a second. I want to point out a couple more things in this article. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so. All right, first of all, one of the defenses people will have about the idea that this Christopher Steele wrote it is they're going to point to the idea, they're going to say, well, the Republicans, first they hired his firm, and then the Democrats hired his firm to dig up dirt on Trump, essentially, and he was under contract with one of those firms. Yet in this article, it says it invalidates that claim, or at least undermines that claim, by saying that there is no documented evidence that any political campaign or any super PAC paid this organization to do any research. It says, but they may have paid them through sources that are untraceable. I'm like, oh, so that's your evidence? And then they cite the Republicans and the Democrats paid him, says an official who's close to the matter. So this becomes an official who's close to the matter is what we're relying on, even though there's no traceable money trail. So that claim is also undermined and not supported by any real evidence. And then the next thing people might say is they might say, well, because Mother Jones came out and said, well, I'm the person who interviewed him. I didn't reveal his name, but now I'm revealing his name in the rest of that interview. And within that interview, he talks about how this guy said that he just had to come forward. He did not. He was paid like 150,000 pounds or whatever, and he felt that he could not even take this information that he found on Trump to the people who paid him, the unnamed people who paid him, because it was such a threat to national security for the UK and for the United States. And because it was such a threat, he had to take it directly to the FBI or send it to the FBI. So I'm hearing that and I'm saying, wow, this is such a threat to national security that he didn't give it to the people who paid him, but he does give it to the FBI, yet he can't even come forward to validate any of the claims within it or say, yeah, it was me that wrote it, me, James Bond, that wrote it.
And here's the thing. They Operation Mockingbird is where the CIA has had, I think when it was before Congress, I think they had over 1,000 journalists on their payroll. And the idea was they, for national security purposes, wanted to censor information that was getting out there. And also they would give the reporters lots of good stuff too. So everybody won, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But that was a long time ago. The censorship of stuff that could hurt or whatever, or even is just politically like the wrong thing to do, is absolutely total. It's absolutely total. I did talk to some super high ranking guy at a news service.
Oh, you talked to an unnamed source at a news service, huh?
I know the name. I talked to myself. That's the problem with this guy. Don't believe me, but he said they censored stuff all day long. Censor, censor, censor. It was funny because I said, it's us versus them. He said, yeah, I'm them. And I was like, yeah, haha. And my husband literally took me away by the elbow and was like, he's saying he's them. You might want to.
That's funny.
It's like, he's them. Totally. I get it. But he was saying they censor stuff all the time. And he kept asking me, like, how do I listen to your show? I was like, don't. Never mind. I don't want to. But then when I realized how wrong I was, like, about Trump and everything, I if you can't get ahead of them, they're not worried about you, which is good for me. But the CIA stuff, yeah, this story, if it were really this tremendous threat to national security, would absolutely, no one would run it. They would not run it. They just wouldn't. They'd poo-poo it and say it was fake.
They wouldn't identify a spy's name publicly who is on the run. He's on the run because they want people to think that, in my opinion, they want people to think that Putin's going to kill him and that if this guy...
he might show up dead.
This fake guy, exactly. He might show up dead.
This fake guy might be fake dead.
It's going to be Trump and Putin killed him. That's going to be the combination of that. And in my opinion, that triggers the feeling inside of America of, oh my gosh, we have a Russian agent who is president who is willing to kill people who speak out against him. We must reach out to the UN and have them invade our borders and overtake our president. It causes people to beg for international intervention in our country and to take action against the president.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It also would play into fake news hurts real people. And I noticed a theme popping up all over the place.
Fake news hurts real spies.
Yeah, I guess that you don't have a lot of sympathy for that guy. But for Trump is supposedly like super sensitive to criticism and slaps people down, won't have meetings with you if you make fun of him. So he's the perfect guy to be the censorship president. And people can object to it, like the right objected to Obamacare, but it still happened. And when they reform Obamacare, it's probably going to be worse. So when they have the cybersecurity omnibus censorship bill under Trump and they reform it under whoever the next guy is, then it might still be worse. It's just they usher this stuff in. They have protests to make it look like they're two sides and they're fighting the good fight. And, oh, darn, the bad guy won, but democracy is still alive and well. A lot of stuff plays into this.
Right. And the whole thing about Trump being sensitive to criticism, I'm not buying it. Reading his book, he talks about how he does stuff intentionally.
Yeah, he's got to have thick skin. You cannot.
Yeah, you're not in the public light like that. Getting his entire career, he's been a very controversial figure. So, like, he sees from, at least from my reading of his book and his actions, he sees criticism as an opportunity to steal the headlines for his own goals.
He's also vengeful. Like, that was another thing that comes up out of his books and stuff.
He might be vengeful, yeah.
I don't know how much of this stuff is real or not. I mean, it's arguable that he's been a handled person for 30 years. That is arguable that his image has been managed. I don't know. But if some of the earlier reports, I mean, we would have to be that long for this stuff to actually be a persona that's been constructed for this long. But Obama had that kind of a history. It was just a constructed persona for so long. But if part of that, if he truly has vengeful tendencies, then he could be bombastic and polarizing and still go after the people on the other side. I don't know. I don't know.
I think he is probably. I mean, everybody might have a little bit of that, but I also think that is by publicly seeming to be vengeful and blocking people out. What you've done is you've put yourself in an advantageous negotiation spot if that person needs you. So if by seemingly being vengeful. Like, say he does something like and blocking somebody completely out. That puts him in an advantage of negotiation because that person wants back in, and he gets to set the conditions.
Scares people straight.
Exactly.
You know, like a mob tactic. That works.
I want to read a passage that that supports what you just said about the censorship. Now, this is from Edward Bernays' his book is called Public Relations. All throughout the book, he can't help not calling it propaganda because he loves that. So, like, people who work in public relations probably don't see themselves as propagandists, but that is the origin of this profession. All right, here's the passage. The willingness of the Americans to bear the war's burden was strengthened by the work of the Committee on Public Information, which stimulated the people to put forth efforts far in excess of what could have been extracted by legal compulsion. The conscription of opinion, like the draft of soldiers, outran the organization of the industrial machine. Established in the week of America's declaration of war, the committee mobilized all available means of publicity. It bombarded the public unceasingly with enthusiastic reports of the nation's colossal war effort and with contrast of our war aims and those of our allies. So basically, we're doing it for good reasons. They're evil. Either by agreement. Oh, here it is. This is the part. All right. This is the part that connects with what you were saying. Dissenting voices were distilled either by agreement with the press or by the persuasive action of the agents of the Department of Justice.
Wow.
Yeah. And Bernays was part of the propaganda committee. So this isn't like an outsider speculating, you know? And there's some other quotes that are just, you read this and it's just unbelievable.
The part about how much more you can get out of people by motivating them over forcing them, compulsion, is it's so what I think underlies the whole like 50% tax or 40%, whatever that, like, if you look at everything you spend on your property tax, sales tax, income tax, state and local, all the taxes, it's a lot of taxes. It really does approach 50% if you think about all that production going to the government. And in any case, they spend almost 50% altogether. But I think about that as slavery, like this tax slavery, this debt slavery, the voluntary slavery. They get you to work as hard as you possibly can. I mean, as hard as you can to get out from under the debt while carrying the yoke of the taxes. You work so crazy hard. People, you know, somebody like me, I never really wanted to be an investment banker. I just was poor and I wanted money, and I worked like a dog. I never would have done that. I'm not greedy or materialistic or anything like that. I'm lazy. So I would have been, I mean, for them to get me that way, I had to be poor. I had to want to not be poor, and it had to take forever to get there, because that's why the progressive tax rate just keeps you going. You can never cash out. You can never accumulate capital and, you know, go Ron Paul or John Galt. You just can't. And it's so much more effective than slavery with like chains.
Right. It's making people choose. Making them choose their servitude, self-policing. Yeah,
it's self-enforcing. You don't have to actually watch them or anything. And the amount of production you get out of it is just tremendous, to the point where I think they do like throw away money. Like they intentionally reduce, they waste money just to keep us in this higher tax situation so that we keep working like that. And it keeps us busy. It keeps us from causing trouble. But just for them to take half of it at this level of production, they just get so much more out of us by keeping us hungry.
Right. I mean, they maintain the myth of American lifestyle as well, where it's the working 9 to 5. That is the dream, whether you like the job or not. Even if you're not using your best skills, it's established in the mindset of children through public education. One of these propaganda books, I believe it was Laswell, he talked about building psychological barriers in the minds of the propagandees, so that, like you just said, they self-reinforce. You don't have to watch them. They will not act outside of that barrier that's built in their minds. And that starts with the education system with, here's the myth of success in America that you're supposed to follow. If you do not follow it, you're going to be a homeless loser on the street. You're going to be on welfare. You're going to be miserable. So you must take these types of actions, and this is what success looks like. And this is what being an outsider looks like. This is what being socially isolated looks like. And the majority of people do not step outside of those walls.
Yeah, I believe it. I think there is some truth to it, though, in that the more they do funnel all the power and the money and everything to the top through these corporations, through these institutions that everybody belongs to, that when they take all the used to be when radio first started, people just squatted on a frequency and started broadcasting. And just like when you homestead in uncharted territory, it worked great. The government came in, shut that down, and started licensing it to people. And then they aggregate it and they toe the party line. And so if you want to be broadcasting radio, you simply must go through a corporation, or like Turner with all their TV station. It works with TV too. I'm just saying you might not actually be able to operate outside the box with all this centrally controlled economy anymore.
I think you can.
But you're not a defeatist, yeah. So you tell me. What we're doing for now.
Yeah, there's always going to be that ebb and flow of creativity that opens up new holes where people do accomplish things, and then of course once it becomes an influential thing at a mass scale, there's an attempt to co-opt it by the government. But I think that's where the creativity of Benjamin Franklin types come in, and I do think that is what, especially when people get a whole lot of power, I think they lose that edge, and I think that's the edge that maybe we say
that's a good point, because look at what we're doing right now. So we're completely defying what I just explained, right? I just said I don't believe that what we're doing right now could happen. Right. And we're doing it. Of course, I don't know if we will ever make a living doing it. I don't know if that's possible, but we could still do it and add value. But the reason it's interesting, the reason there's a market for it, is that the big and powerful and co-opted won't serve the market. They control the information.
Yeah, and they gave.
I've like when I'm on the actual radio, I've never been told what to say. I've sensed from the people around me that it would be crazy for me to go and say, like, this Boston Marathon bombing story doesn't make sense. The pressure, just the social pressure, was tremendous. But at the top, they told me I could say whatever I want, and I did. So I think a lot of it is fear, and you have a lot more at stake when you're actually are making a living doing it. But at the same time, it makes people like naturally control themselves, cut off the edges. And then, but that means there are unserved markets out there and opportunities to, try to actually get to the truth without any thought to what your higher up wants to hear. But I just feel like this is a moment in time, and that they're going to close this. Hopefully another thing will open up. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
it always does. The human creativity is something that, like that brain initiative, that they'll never be able to completely map the billions of neurons.
I know, but they can just give out free virtual reality headsets and it's over.
That's true, but there's also, people.
Humanity is a thing of the past.
They don't give the public, the individual, as much credit. That's where their egos come in, and you can see it throughout all of these elitist propaganda books, these manuals, where they give no credit to the public, and time again, the public has proven them wrong, and that'll continue to happen. It's a continual balance.
Give me an example where they've been proven wrong. I feel like the march is steady.
What we're doing, what you just said right now, what you just said right now, like what we're doing right now is something that Bernays and Littman would have said is not possible. It is the communications were so controlled that people would not be able to break in other ways. And even if we've only just started doing this stuff, but there are people who have done it and who do reach a larger, broad audience who've been doing it for a little while longer. Like this type of thing, they didn't give the public any type of they didn't have any confidence in the public being able to seize these types of opportunities with the way that they speak.
Because they gave us the internet. The Department of Defense gave us it was released through the public university system. They did it, and I would think that they could anticipate some of it, and they're going to claw it back. Oh, plus it's a giant disinformation machine. That was what that great article by Philosophy of Metrics was.
It's the biggest propaganda machine that ever existed.
It's a way to, I know, but it's not just that. It's just the fact that it overwhelms you in and of itself. It's just the cognitive dissonance it creates is in itself a paralyzing, powerful, a paralytic. See, this is why I have to use those words because they're.
What does paralytic mean?
It paralyzes you. When you get a surgery, they give you a pain reliever, they give you a paralytic, and they give you an amnesia, something that gives you amnesia because they want it to not hurt. They want you to be unconscious, and you can't move because you would screw up the operation. So if the painkiller thing doesn't work, but the paralytic does work, and you can't move to tell them that you can feel it, they give you an amnesia factor, an amnesia agent so you don't remember if you woke up during the operation. Isn't that funny? That's what they do. I think
so
I've heard it.
They cover for themselves by giving you an amnesia thing. Like you could be screaming the whole time. Well, I guess you can't scream because of the paralytic.
You can't scream because of the paralytic. That's the problem, is that if you were screaming, they would help you, but you can't scream, so they cut your heart out.
Horrifying nightmare to me.
They give you a heart transplant. I saw a TV show about it, but I've also, like, over the years, gathered that I do believe it's correct. Anyway, so it's paralyzing to be overwhelmed by this information, this cognitive dissonance. It is in itself quite an unnerving phenomenon, and it makes me feel like a lot of this is, I just wonder if it's a waste of time to try to figure it out. Like maybe what we're really supposed to do is let them have it and hug our kids, just get back to basics and move to some mountain and step off the grid. I guess that's what the preppers are doing. Maybe I'm a prepper at heart.
Now that is what a lot of people are doing, and I think that is a trend that will continue to emerge as technology advances. I think more and more people will try to separate from it as much as they possibly can while still surviving. They might try to create conditions where nowhere in the world you can live without some way being connected. But
that's my thing about Obamacare. It's the first thing I could think of. Even the Selective Service does not make you register, doesn't make every single solitary person on earth register, but Obamacare makes every single American register. Even bums are required, right? You have to prove that you have insurance. Everyone's required to do it. It's a registration system, in my opinion. I believe that's its primary purpose.
Oh, I agree. I agree with that.
So my mom told me that Judge Napolitano met with Donald Trump today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Judge Napolitano he was a hardcore libertarian who had a show on Fox, and he was the youngest guy to be appointed to the bench. And I wonder about these guys who have to watch what they say, like Ron Paul. Never goes too deep on 9/11, but he does always exploit limited hangouts, like Edward Snowden, who I think is fake, whatever, still works for the government. He put a lot of stuff out there, which is damaging to the government. That's the nature of a limited hangout. And I feel like Ron Paul and Judge Napolitano stay within the boundaries of still being able to get on mainstream media. And, but they do point out things that are damaging to the government without stepping over that line. But it makes you wonder if those people are real or are they limited hangouts themselves. So you have to always
Right.
wonder. And he was a friend of Antonin Scalia, who my mother praised too. She thinks he's a saint, but you can scratch the surface. And I think that he has made a few screwed up rulings. I never really made a study of it, but I'm not convinced on Antonin Scalia. But Napolitano just loved him. They were good friends, and I just wonder if he gets picked by Trump, that I think that would be really super fantastic, even if he is a limited hangout in himself, just because it would be a great improvement.
So he's been considered for the Supreme Court?
I don't know. I have absolutely no idea. Like, my mother called me when I was on my way to my office, and so I don't know for sure. But I would assume that that's why he would meet with him.
Well, that would be an interesting pick. That would be a good move.
It would give Trump a lot of credibility, even though it probably wouldn't change the direction of the Supreme Court, because he could then put a bunch of crackpots in afterwards. You know what I mean? Because the others will die. Or if there's a deal, if he's super deep state, the older ones could step out, knowing, even if they're Democrats or whatever, knowing that this is a setup and that Trump will use this as cover to put more liberal guys in. But, that's really speculating a couple of steps down the road. But, of course, that's how they play chess. So
it is, definitely. Bernays is all about the long con, I guess, is what con artists call it.
Yeah, but it's so hard to predict the game. You don't even know what game they're playing.
We had a little bit of technical difficulties, but we're back now. I'm not quite sure. Are you there?
I am here.
Good. Not quite sure exactly where we left off. So I want to wrap up what I was talking about earlier about how the British manipulated us into World War I and II, and point out some of the similarities between what happened back then and what I see going on right now in regards to this Russia-British spy dossier situation. Okay, I'm just going to start by reading you some quotes from some of the World War I and II propagandists that are pretty revealing, in my opinion. This first quote is from Edward Bernays. He was a member of the first United States propaganda agency, the Committee on Public Information. It's in his book, Public Relations, and in the quote, he is reflecting back on the success of the World War I propaganda. He says, critics charged that sometimes the Committee on Public Relations, volunteers got hysterical. He's talking about in their efforts to propagandize the public. But after all, hysteria was generally prevalent at the time. Reports that the Germans were beasts and Huns were generally accepted. The most fantastic atrocity stories were believed. After the war, there was widespread disillusion with the reaction against propaganda. The American people resented their own wartime gullibility. Now, that's Edward Bernays talking about how he used atrocity stories to, the Committee on Public Information, and how the public discovered a lot of these lies after the war through the publication of memoirs and the opening up of archives, and just talking about the gullibility. Now, there's some other people from the Committee of Public Information that also talked about that. Now, here is a quote from this is a book published prior to World War II. It's called Getting Us into War. It's written by Porter Sargent, and he's pulling directly from the horse's mouth. It's an amazingly sourced book. Here's the quote. America was essential. Her resources, her money, her manpower could only save the British, but it was not alone the love of England that would bring us in. It must be the hatred of evil. A devil must be created to arouse our moral purpose. Okay, so demonization for the purpose of creating moral justification for going to war. He goes on in this next passage that I'm about to quote to describe how the British approach disseminating propaganda across the entire country, across America, without Americans realizing it. Okay, here it is. Again, in this passage, he's describing the British approach to propagandizing the American public. Subtle, working from the top down, through the President, the State Department, universities, intellectuals, it is suspected by few. We are unaware. As in 1914 through 1918, we think we are responsible to our own sense of right, and on a higher moral ground taking action against the forces of evil. All right, so he's pointing out that the same thing is happening to us, again, that happened to us 20 years ago. The same people that manipulated us into World War I without us knowing it are again manipulating us into World War II without us knowing it, using a similar top-down approach. And that's what he does throughout this book, is he's showing the parallels between World War I and World War II and how history is repeating itself. And this stuff isn't just his opinion. He provides a wealth of sources, including a book written by a British intelligence officer, a propagandist, whose job it was to propagandize the American public, who wrote a book for the British intelligence community that openly describes how they're going to manipulate the American public into World War II after having already done it in World War I. The book's title is Propaganda in the Next War, and the British propagandist who wrote it, his name is Captain Sidney Rogerson. And the book was published in 1938, I believe, 3 years prior to Pearl Harbor, probably written years before that. It's an extremely rare book. Here are direct passages from that book. In this first passage, he's talking about what it's going to take to get America into World War II after having already fooled us one time, the approach they're going to have to use. It will need a definite threat to America, a threat which will have to be brought home by propaganda to every citizen before the Republic will again take arms in an external quarrel. The position will naturally be considerably eased if Japan were involved, and this might and probably would bring America in without further ado.
Whoa, hold on. That's very interesting, because I never thought of that. That in the First World War, it was really an uphill battle to get us involved in that, and it was about democracy versus monarchy, and I guess colonialism, whatever. People fell for that, but were war weary and didn't want to fall for it again, and knew they had fallen for something. So, boy, did you have to have some kind of atrocious behavior, which Stalin, our ally, also exhibited, by the way. But it didn't matter. Like the atrocities can't possibly be the real reason we entered the war, or we would have been at war with Stalin and Hitler and Japan. But it's interesting what you're pointing out, because they simply had to have, like a devil on earth.
Yeah, they used
like they needed something so powerful.
And yeah.
And Japan, like especially when you had race issues, that would be super scary.
Exactly. And the last sentence of that, and this is a quote directly from Sidney Rogerson, the last sentence of that is, at any rate, it would be a natural and obvious object of our propagandists to achieve this, just as during the Great War they succeeded in embroiling the United States with Germany. So he's referencing how they did it during World War I and how, in order to do it again, they're going to need to embroil the United States with Japan.
It's so funny because in World War I, first of all, we had more German descendants here than English, and we were allied with a monarchy. They acted like they were fighting against an empire, and monarchs can make the world safe for democracy, but we were fighting for the English empire.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was, yeah.
Did I ever tell you this? I was standing behind somebody online at a Weight Watchers meeting, and it was in an old, like a veterans hall, and all the propaganda posters on the wall were genuine vintage World War I propaganda, and it had, babies on the end of bayonets or whatever, like, sew up your socks, don't waste your socks, do it for him, it showed a soldier, doughboy or whatever. And I looked at it, it's like that, we have to beat the monster, the devil, or whatever it was. And I just said to like the random person standing next to me, that was so ridiculous. Like what beef could we possibly have had with those people on the other side? And she said, but they were monsters. And I said, no, this is World War I stuff. Like I got the Nazi thing, but this is World War I. Like who was a monster? And she was like, they were monsters. It's like, exactly. You don't even know. Maybe they were monsters. Maybe they were, but she has no idea what World War I was fought over. You know what I mean? No. Like there's no chance, but she's looking at this and she's looking at me like I am a lunatic or a Nazi, and I was trying to explain, she was like, this is World War I. Why do you feel passionately that we simply had to do everything we could to stop the Germans in World War I? I mean, am I missing something? I don't remember.
No, the history, we aren't taught the history of that. We're taught this very simplistic notion of the history. Another quote from the same guy, I don't know where it is, but he basically says, "I'm afraid we won't be able to basically manipulate the Americans into war again unless we make Japan and the United States get embroiled too." So they very much talk about how they manipulated
and that was
us.
True.
Right. And here is, I got two more quotes, and then I want to relate it to like two quick things that I noticed that recently happened. One quote is, this is Lord Northcliffe. He was one of the organizers of the propaganda campaign, because they established propaganda offices all over the United States. Sir Gilbert Parker, who was like a writer and worked with a foreign embassy or something. He was one of the main guys. It all came from the Wellington House. But here are quotes from Northcliffe and Parker. Northcliffe said in 1917, when they were talking about the propaganda effort to propagandize the United States, "They dress alike, they talk alike, they act alike. What sheep?" Talking about the American people, how easily to manipulate they are. And they're talking about the heads of universities, the heads of newspapers, the publishers, the people at the highest levels with the authority to influence others. That's who they targeted. Now, here's what Sir Gilbert Parker remarked. He remarked, "The American people were more gullible than any people except the Chinese." These are them talking after the war about how easy to manipulate the Americans were. And then, this Peterson guy is talking about how, well, they found out that they were manipulated. They had this disillusionment, which Bernays referred to in that quote earlier. So how are we going to manipulate them again? We got to embroil them with Japan. So, all right, so that's
because I feel like we are, again, a lot of the stuff that happens with Russia and on the international stage and stupid things we do and our ridiculous themes and stuff, I try not to forget that the Russian population is a propaganda target right now, and they're a lot less gullible than we are because they know that mainstream media is government owned. They've been raised on that. They absolutely are less likely to fall for it. We, on the other hand, have been convinced that you can believe this stuff, even if the Wall Street Journal could be owned by a British intelligence agent for all I know. But so sometimes these propaganda themes here that seem a little ridiculous maybe aren't really designed for us, but and actually our government's we are allowed to propagandize our domestic population if its ultimate target is a foreign population. So that could get them get around maybe everybody going to jail if it ever comes out. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah.
All right, well, now here's how I'm relating it to this. Now, I don't know if this is what's going on. All I'm pointing out is the patterns of history, and those first two wars, the main objective was not what they said it was. It was, world government, essentially, and economic plunder. I see the same patterns
and
kind of
neutralizing Germany as a threat to England.
Right.
Or as an ally to Russia.
Yeah, with the demonization of Russia, it just seems too over the top to be. It just seems like such a psyop. And now with these British connections seemingly emerging from it, it just seems. And the fact that we weren't taught this history growing up, it seems like the same thing going on again. People getting manipulated at the highest levels.
The parallels are crazy, and they keep trying to draw parallels about populism, about revolution with the past as these, which drives me crazy about cheap, facile literature these days. Facile meaning like easy to facilitate, where they'll just plug in stereotypes or plug in familiar narratives. It's almost like we're so jaded by formulaic stories, they don't even bother to like fill in the details. They're just like, oh, Formula A. It's just how I feel like if you know anything about history, you can see parallels with everything from, and if you didn't see it, I didn't see what they were doing with Russia. I didn't see that what they were saying was, we're dealing with pre-communist Russia and a pre-World War I world order. That's what Putin wants. That came out of this so-called Christopher Steele document.
Yeah.
That narrative, which gave me a reference point in history that I just hadn't drawn the connection myself. I often do, but they will always find a way to just spell it out to you in the simplest possible terms, which is why in 2016, when the Wall Street Journal just would not stop with this populism, nationalism theme and why, and they had a series, The Great Unraveling, and it all started with the Great Recession. And it smacked as completely untrue to me. And because the difference is we have 50 million people on food stamps. We have half the population doesn't work and doesn't want to work. We just don't have a crisis mentality. You're not starving. You're not this segregated guy who can't get a job. You're not a Dust Bowl farmer whose children are literally starving to death. You just don't have crisis level issues. And they're drawing parallels to crises in the past and just hoping that you can use that prototype in your mind.
Trying to trigger familiar myths that are embedded within.
Carl Jung used to talk archetypes. It's like archetypal associations that make you perhaps accept that this is the pattern of history, that history has a pattern, that cause and effect is established, and that the intellectuals will tell you how it works. And it's frustrating to me because the Wall Street Journal is just such propaganda, but it's got big words. I don't understand it. So I'm like, I just don't understand it. And it's kooky, but they really, 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 try to form these narratives. And then I'm pretty sure that those previous events, the World War I propaganda, stuff like that, those too were full of false created propaganda narratives that tapped into those people's previous experience. Rome. And I mean, even somebody was talking today about the methods of control that they're using today that are based on Roman, that the Romans discovered it all, like the Greeks discovered philosophy, Rome discovered or invented politics. And they really did. I mean, law is in Latin for a reason, and medicine is in Greek for a reason. And you could probably, I mean, if I had any knowledge of the classics, I'd probably be a pretty formidable news analyst.
Right. Yeah, me too. Well, what's interesting about the propaganda agencies back then, and probably now as well, is the British propaganda agencies, the Wellington House. They had propaganda like houses all over America, and they set it up to where no one person knew everything.
Yeah, cells.
They set up cells so they could essentially keep people. Even the propagandists are kept compartmentalized. Here's how this connects to this thing with the spy, with Remington Steele or Christopher Steele or James Bond, whatever we're calling him. Is all right. You remember what's his name? McCain. He's like 250 years old. Waddled up to Canada, I guess, and he met with apparently one of the British ambassadors to Russia or something, or a former British ambassador to Russia. And the story is apparently this guy gave him inside information. He did not give him a dossier, but he gave him inside information that a dossier or that information that was negative to Trump existed. And then McCain took this to the FBI, right? Now, this guy's name who gave him this information is Sir Andrew Wood, that's his name, a former Moscow ambassador. He was McCain's secret contact, right? And these guys are all named like Sir and Lord and whatnot. And they used that during World War I because it lent a prestige. And the Americans they were trying to influence, they would set up parties at their houses so that their wives can say, I'm having one of the lords over.
That's great. Like Bernays is called Doctor.
Exactly. Yeah. So they would use that prestige factor. And so that guy is the one who apparently leaked this information, or some of the information anyway. And I looked something up earlier today. Now, I don't know. I still got to research the credibility of this, but there was a document written by the Chatham House. And this guy, Lord Andrew, is now an associate of the Chatham House, which is like a think tank.
Chatham?
Comes
I
up.
think it's
Chatham House, right. Yeah,
it's
Chatham
well
House.
known. So
right.
To know what you're talking about.
A think tank. And
isn't it part of the whole roundtable thing of Council of Rome? That whole,
I believe so.
The origin of the great conspiracy, or I would say, I don't know what the real origin is, but one focal point is Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, who established kind of the secret society, and his goal was to restore the British Empire secretly by spreading social democracy and the English language and their all of that around the world. I think possibly even through war. So like Vietnam was destroyed or whatever. That whole region was basically invaded by war, and now they're sweatshops instead of villages.
Right. Yeah. They're in this at the deepest levels, essentially, from what I gather. But they published a document in 2015 where this Sir Parker or Sir Andrew Wood was one of the people who contributed to it, one of 6 people, that was titled The Russian Challenge. And it was essentially a declaration of why they need to conduct information war on the Russians. And the motto of it is independent thinking since 1920. And the guy who wrote the article says that they're making the case for service and information war against Russia. The intelligence analysts working with commercial due diligence companies in London say that the report is blind, and they say that an all well-known London banker, again, all well-known, unnamed, so got to validate the source. But they say they've raised all this corporate money, which they actually cite the corporate money that's raised for the Chatham House, and it's all. He's saying that it's all being raised to discredit Russia, so that they can essentially establish war on them. And that's a quick breeze of this document and of somebody who surmised it. So I need to still look at it a little bit deeper. Do what?
When was that particular document written?
This was published in 2015 in June. And basically, one of the things it talked about is, I think what was the flight that some people say that Russia, it was at 370, or that they say that Russia took down?
MH17 in Ukraine?
Yes, that one. Yeah. That one right there. They say that within this document that they published, that the British say it's conclusive that Russia took down that plane. We knew that 4 days after it happened. And the article's talking about how could you
reported it 4 hours after it happened.
Yeah,
Shep
how could
Smith,
you possibly know? Yeah, so it points out some of the ridiculousness within this document of how they jump to just extreme conclusions.
Yeah, it was. I read a lot on that. There was. So the evidence was hard to analyze. Even I don't know what happened. I mean, I think Kiev.
It
took
reminds
the air
me.
traffic controllers. They escorted the air traffic controllers from Kiev who saw what was happening out. Like those guys were disappeared. So obviously there was a mystery as to what actually happened.
And that's kind of what this article is pointing to. They're pointing to the flimsy evidence that they're relying on, and how the purpose of the document is to say this is why we need all this funding to establish information warfare on Russia. And this guy who leaked this information to John McCain is one of the chief creators of this document. It kind of reminds me of what was called the Bryce Report, which was written during World War I, which was, I can't remember, the other name was something like it was like a dossier of the German atrocities that gave reason for, blaming everything on.
And then it turned out later to be false, and
a lot of it turned out not to be supported. There are people who argue the opposite side, but a lot of it was unsubstantiated. But what they did was they got the highest authorities that people trusted more than anybody else, the most prominent historians and scientific people, so that people wouldn't question it, and they got them to be the authors of it and to spread it around to top officials, so they would then in turn spread it around to the people who followed them, which they have these 6 people who are authorities who are creating this document that this guy is pointing out the flimsy evidence that it's using, but they're using it to spread around so that they can get money and get support for conducting information war against Russia.
It sounds like the climate change thing.
Yes,
it was just all about authority.
I think my point with that whole spiel is that it was the British that manipulated us into World War I and World War II using propaganda that we were completely unaware of, that we didn't recognize, a top-down authority-based approach, while they demonized this other enemy that they turned our attention to. And we didn't even look at them. They could freely propagandize us because we were so focused on this evil demon we needed to stop. I see some of the same patterns going on right now. It's really interesting to me that the guy who supposedly, or who says that he leaked information to McCain when he met him in Canada, is this British guy who was responsible for writing that document about the Russian challenge and how they needed to propagandize, conduct psych war on Russia, and how this other British spy, MI5 guy, is supposedly responsible for writing this Trump dossier. It all seems like a familiar narrative as what played out prior to World War I and World War II.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would like to I'll look forward to seeing your show notes because I want to read that stuff.
Yeah, no, I'll send the document for the document.
Anytime I see like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, blah, 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 I'm like, these guys are the most ridiculous deep state operative, most hysterical, we have to nuke Iran. I mean, you can find quotes like Iran's going to nuke us. And then I was watching this thing, debates with Ron Paul in 2012, where he's arguing with Rick Santorum and Michelle Bachmann, who are saying, you don't understand, you Pollyanna or whatever, Dr. Paul, Iran is going to nuke us or nuke Israel by the end of the year. Like if we don't nuke them first, within 12 months they're going to have nukes and they're going to use them. I mean, they were freaking out about it. And McCain and Graham say stuff like that too. It's just after a certain point, how anyone takes them seriously is beyond me. Anyway,
Lindsey Graham, I think he's drunk every time he speaks in public, in my opinion.
Maybe
he just seems like a cartoon character, like an insane drunk at a bar who belligerently yells, "There's a nuke in Charleston!" You know, just wherever he just walks around screaming sensational claims of people.
In one of the debates, he was standing on a phone book or something like that. Like literally, like if you could see that he was on a platform. So it was such a weird, image manipulation thing. It started to make me wonder about the guy. Like he's really a crafted image. How could they play along with that on the national stage? Seemed strange. But I
thought you were going to say he was sitting on John McCain's shoulders behind them.
I think that's metaphorically accurate. Anyway, so there's always more than we can cover.
Yeah.
I think we need to do this more often.
We both have so much information we like to.
No, we do have a show. I don't know if this will be out. Yeah, this will be out by then. Yeah, we have a show live on WSB in Atlanta, but you can also just get it at WSBradio.com at showtime, 4 to 6 Eastern time this Saturday, which is January 21st. So if people like to hear the calls, there's a lot of suspense because the real world gets to tell us how we don't get it or whatever the challenge is at the time. So anyway, that'll be our next thing. But I think this wraps it up for episode 22 of the Propaganda Report.
See you later.
Of hypocrisy, have you had enough? Of the spitting spree, have you had enough? Does it make you want to scream and shout? Yes it does, yes it does. Have you had enough? Of the rubber stamps, have you had enough? The wiretaps.